this is going to be a fascinating glimpse into the background of why it is that we are all here, of all places, today. So please give a big round of applause to Mr. Paul Weston.
It's a measure of the voltage of this event that a book has manifested from the initial impetus of me signing up for this presentation. And the way in which it's happened is quite interesting as well. 2 years ago, I was asked to write an introduction for a new edition of the classic 70s anthology, Glastonbury, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem. So I commissioned local artist Yuri Leach to do an image based on an idea I had, a Glastonbury version of the famous Aleister Crowley, Lady Freda Harris sun card. The whole thing looked pretty nice in comparison to the original. I wrote the introduction, I was very happy with it. But the person that I was working in collaboration with stalled on this, and as this conference grew nearer, I became slightly frustrated that I'd got some great material that wasn't actually being made use of. So, the centre of gravity of the whole thing was this guy, Anthony Roberts, who was the editor of the 70s anthology. Here he is in front of his beloved tour. And I'm introducing him with this picture because, as some of you will know, 25 years ago, he actually died of a heart attack on Glastonbury tour. And you go around the internet, you can't find any photographs of him at all. So I'm very grateful to his wife, Jan, for allowing me to make use of some family photos. And more to the point, introducing me to an extraordinary episode in their life, a UFO experience that had occurred in 1969 that led to him writing a huge unpublished text called Giants in the Earth, or tentatively called Giants in the Earth, which was full of a whole bunch of things about aliens, Atlantis, Lemuria, and the Glastonbury Zodiac. So I felt that all of this shed some considerable light on my understanding of the town and how it's perceived, and the influence of what you could call Earth Mysteries Ufology on Glastonbury. This is Catherine Malt Wood, mystical sculptress, discoverer or inventor, depending on your point of view, of the Glastonbury Zodiac. Someone with artistic, mystic sensibilities, a sculptress, therefore someone who's used to finding shapes in form. But one way or another, you know, this starts with her. I'm not going to go into any real detail about her at all, other than to say that you probably are familiar with this image. This is an early depiction of the so-called Glastonbury Zodiac, landscape effigies laid out around here. You can probably figure out somewhere towards the bottom, Leo the Lion. The rest of it, maybe you do have to be looking at it with the eye of a sculptress initially to see what's supposed to be there. Her sense of it, it's been created by a wandering Middle Eastern mystery cult, maybe Sumerians, round about 2700 BC, but we'll soon see that some of the other thinkers that we're going to meet up with put that timescale considerably back. This is Dion Fortune. This is a Yuri Leach image of Dion Fortune, and her work, Avalon of the Heart, published in the 1930s, a compendium of some articles that she wrote for a magazine that she was created for a magical order. And there's a chapter in there called Avalon and Atlantis. And she wondered if there's any possibility that Avalon, with its undercurrent of pagan legend, was originally an Atlantean colony. Is it possible that Merlin was an Atlantean, a priest initiate, and in presiding at the birth of Arthur, he was carrying out the Atlantean custom of the king's bread for wisdom? And she was one of the early people to look at the slopes, the terracing on the Tor, and wonder if it wasn't a little bit more interesting than just something to do with medieval agriculture. She wondered if the slopes of the Tor had been sculpted to resemble an Atlantean temple prototype. Now, also during the 1930s, very interesting chap called John Foster Forbes. You can see him there. He's the one seated on the left in the natty Scottish outfit there. He worked with a couple of pretty interesting female psychics, Olive Pixley and Iris Campbell. And Forbes and Pixley visited Glastonbury Tor in 1930. 1930, that's quite some way back. So think of this in this terms. If somebody using the visionary faculties of a psychic to tune in to Glastonbury Tor in 1930. And she saw, with her eyes open, she didn't have to close her eyes and go into a trance state, a ceremony she believed to have Atlantean origins. A group ascending the tall terraces in pre-dawn twilight in a celebratory manner, involving drumming, singing and chanting alongside the backdrop of the sound of children and dogs. And their collective energy created a serpent path of more subtle energy so that a spiral spread around the hill. And having reached the summit, where she saw a stone circle had once stood, their efforts assisted a vortex descending from the sun, and the resultant energy shot out through the alignments over the land. Nature was stimulated efficaciously, we could say, in the realms of plants and butterflies, what we maybe now refer to as the Devic kingdoms. And the combination of sound and light was the key. Now, Forbes later collaborated with Iris Campbell in 1945 and got similar results. And Forbes and Pixley investigated a whole bunch of sites in the West Country for the book The Unchronicled Past that came out in 1938. And the tour vision is typical of Olive Pixley's general work. She wrote a few books herself, and it clearly anticipates later theories of the presence of a labyrinth on the tour. And 30 years later, as some of you may be aware, John Foster Forbes was a definite influence on John Michell. But we're going to introduce this guy now, Desmond Leslie, unquestionably a major dude. If somebody looking like this walks into the room, people turn around and pay attention. And although he's not directly connected with Glastonbury, we have to examine something of his life and work for the foundations that he provides for important people to follow. Leslie was related to Winston Churchill. At the end of the war, the last day of the war, he cycles up to Downing Street with a bottle of champagne and knocks on the door, well done old boy, to Winston. He'd been a Spitfire pilot. His family was steeped in ancient history, mysticism, spiritualism, and he was brought up in a haunted castle. Now here he is chilling with his wife, Agnes Burnell. She's quite a lady in her own right. She was the first person to perform nude on a London stage in a performance of Oscar Wilde's Salome. Used to sing Bertolt Brecht songs, all this kind of stuff. Leslie himself, an electronic music pioneer. Some of his music was featured in Doctor Who and even in the movie Doctor Strangelove. His Music of the Future CD, there's a little track there, you might just be able to spot 3 down, The Death of Satan. I was going to play you a little snatch of that, but not exactly Reiki circle music, and I thought some of you might find it a little bit disturbing. Sufficient to say, if you are interested, you can find it, like most things, on YouTube. He was also a pioneer in the epoch of reality TV, believe it or not, being part of one of the most famous episodes in the whole history of British television. The biggest show on British TV on Saturday nights was a satirical programme, That Was the Week That Was. It was hosted by David Frost. This is 1962, and it was getting the kind of viewing figures that only, Simon Cowell can only dream of these days. And an occasional participant was the critic, the literary critic, the theatre critic, Bernard Levin. Levin had slagged off Leslie's wife for a performance in a London show. On live TV, Leslie appears out of the audience, challenges Levin, tells him he's a cad and a bounder, and biffs him on the nose. This is in front of 10 million people live on British TV in 1962. You can find that on YouTube as well. So it's pretty extraordinary that Leslie is really the pioneering figure in British ufology, and in one of the pioneering figures in world ufology. When he was a child at boarding school in 1934, The dormitory had been lit up at night by an immense green fireball, and this had generated obviously a lot of excitement amongst the boys there. And when the flying saucer era kicked in, 1947, he remembered this and his interest was immediately piqued. And a spiritualistic message from his dead mother in 1951 pointed him further into the direction of the mystery. And he embarked on a huge mix of reading and started writing his contribution to the book Flying Saucers Have Landed. And he starts off with a survey of the recent cases, and he delves into the anomalous phenomenon recorded by Charles Fort. But a lot of the stuff that he deals with comes from the late 19th century literature of Blavatsky's Theosophy. W. Scott Elliott's Atlantis and Lemuria contained ideas that have become a staple of ancient astronaut theory right up to the present day with the Ancient Aliens TV series. Hindu literature speaks of the Vimanas that appear to be, flying craft that fought a science fiction war in the skies of ancient India. And there seem to be accounts of what would be the equivalent of atomic explosions. And the Vimanas may even have been able to travel beyond our planet. So Leslie felt that there's a strong suggestion that there existed previously not one, but several humanities, greater, wiser, more moral and more advanced in certain aspects of natural science than ourselves. In fact, not one but several interplanetary migrations from Earth have taken place in the past by means of the Vimanas. And the site of the last departure was not the Atlantean mainland, but Giza itself. So the kind of literature that he'd investigated and the mix he created would prove to be the template of much of what was to come. Sunken continents, ancient technology, the Great Pyramid and the mystery of its construction are all considered with the possibility that there's a lost art of sound engineering that might have been employed. And the antiquity of some of these sites is kind of extended way beyond archaeology. He talks about Tiwanaku and so on. And he also looked at Celtic mythological tales of flying chariots and stated that Cuchulainn, the Irish hero, is a composite character of a Celtic Atlantean warlord. And although acknowledging the findings of modern science concerning its somewhat inhospitable physical conditions, Leslie affirmed the unutterably strange but compelling theosophical lore concerning beings of different vibrational level living on Venus. They care for the human race and have intervened on Earth. The theosophists Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter had referred to Brahmin tables in their book Man, Where, Whence and Whither. And they were quite clear that 18,618,793 years ago, we experienced contact from Venus. Then, with the mighty roar of swift descent from incalculable heights, surrounded by blazing masses of fire which filled the sky with shooting tongues of flame, the vessels of the Lords of the Flame flashed through the aerial spaces. It halted over the white island which lay in the Gobi Sea. Green it was and radiant with the fairest blossoms as Earth offered her fairest and best to welcome her king. Sanat Kumara became Lord of the world and established a base in Shambhala. And this concept, one way or another, has been present amongst most of the more well-known New Age teachers from that point onwards. So Leslie concluded his section of the book with this vastly archaic Venus contact story to nicely lead into a first-person modern account of what could be taken to be a long-term scenario. George Adamski remains the most famous and notorious contactee, a man who's still able to massively polarise opinions and certainly been responsible for some well-kitsch art over the last few decades. The legendary story that in 1952 he received a telepathic message calling him to a meeting in the desert with the Euphonauts, and he went out with a group into the Mojave later stating that they saw a big silver cigar-shaped craft fly by, and asking his friends to stand clear, he volunteers to move away into the desert and sees a smaller vessel come down and land nearby. And he meets up with one of the classic 50s contacts, Hawthorne, this long-haired male, looking quite human, wearing some kind of ski suit. And through telepathy, Hawthorne gives a warning to the world about the dangers of nuclear power, which is not a million miles away from the whole general vibe of the recent hit movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean for sure that Adamski is just making it up and cashing it in. You know, maybe it really is true to say that something serious was hanging in the airwaves at that time. The big selling point of Adamski's contribution to the book is, of course, these notorious photos. You either love them or you hate them. It's possible to get, even in the present day in America, a kind of kit like an Airfix model of one of these sources. It's well good. I contemplated buying one myself, actually. But these are the Venusian scout ship. And obviously the book gets a huge mauling from the establishment. But Desmond Leslie seems to actually enjoy this. He ends up appearing on British TV in programmes like Panorama. And because he knows people like Churchill, because he's aristocratic, and he's got all these kind of contacts into the British establishment that a lot of people writing a book like this simply would never have. And he was able to advance his message around. And Adamski, you know, went on a truly bizarre journey, you know, as international ambassador for the space people. People still argue about whether he was put up by the CIA or what on earth was going on. But I like what John Michell says in his introduction to the sympathetic study by Colin Bennett, Looking for Hawthorne. He was an impressive old rogue like Madame Blavatsky and in the same tradition. Such people, according to Plato, are the kind whom the gods choose to enlighten us. I'm sure that's right, and that changes in our minds are brought about by the gods in their due seasons, and often through highly dubious characters. Brinsley le Poer Trench, who became the Earl of Clancarty, was Britain's most prestigious, at least in terms of social standing, UFO enthusiast. You know, he would eventually use his position in the House of Lords to try and initiate a top-level investigation of the subject. He was an articulate, early advocate of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and he was also a champion of Catherine Malt Wood and the Glastonbury Zodiac, seeing her work in the context of his own unusual interests. Now, The Sky People, his first book, was published in 1960, and there are some ideas in there that could definitely be considered a tad eccentric, but they've achieved longevity, and I'm sure that even if you've never read this book, some of the ideas will be, in many respects, familiar to you because they've been taken up by a number of other people. Trench believed that the Garden of Eden story described events that occurred on Mars. There are two creation accounts in Genesis. To him, they refer to two different strains of humanity. There's Adam 1, the galactic man, the Elohim line, who has a godlike destiny in the stars. This race has been known as the Serpent People, and they're the source of the many traditions of culture-bringer deities in human form, such as Osiris. The other line were, if you like, genetically engineered, created by means of the science of these other beings to perform certain definite and predetermined functions. Not quite a slave race, but a servant race anyway, a basic workforce. And then you've got the inevitable crossbreeding, the famous lines in Genesis about the sons of God and the daughters of men. The new strain, a new mix became predominant, and much of the conflict in the human psyche is down to this. And Noah's Ark was a spaceship that transported humans to Earth after the melting of the ice caps on Mars caused a flood. And something of this story gets blended in with the Atlantean story, and so on. Trench has also got a background in Blavatsky. He's taken Desmond Leslie on. He talks a lot about Atlantis and Mu. Atlantis had spaceships, there was contact with other planets, they had power sources that surpassed nuclear energy, and its prime was in a huge distant antiquity, 30,000 years ago. and a sequence of catastrophes gradually brought it down. It was his next book, Men Among Mankind, in 1962, where he starts talking about Glastonbury. He'd been corresponding with Catherine Malt Wood's husband, John, shortly after the period that she died. He came to the conclusion that Britain was part of Atlantis that didn't sink, and he lengthened the timescale suggested by Malt Wood for the construction of the Zodiac. In this version, there were Atlanteans who had realised that the final catastrophe was coming and built, in conjunction with the Sky People, a gigantic landmark which could easily be picked out from the sky on the disrupted surface of the unhappy planet, a legacy from their Atlantean forebearers which is infinitely greater than either Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid in Egypt, the most sacred spot on Earth. And he interpreted certain features of the Glastonbury configuration to support the Sky People cosmology. For example, there's only one of the twins of Gemini shown in the Glastonbury Zodiac. And as far as he's concerned, this is to suggest that the other twin is in space in the sky, and that the original sense of the Zodiac was to keep it in the memories of the men of two planets, a purpose, a promise. The promise that those separated parts would in time come together again to their mutual benefit, and the prophecy of the date and time of that coming back into communication. If, as we are told, the age of Aquarius is to be the age of the regeneration of man, it is to Glastonbury and to the Temple of the Stars that we must look for information regarding our immediate future. From Britain, the world was civilised again. And here's something of the sensibility suggested by another Atlantean enthusiast, William Blake, when he said that all things begin and end in Albion's ancient druid rocky shore. Egyptian adepts, heirs to Atlantis, travelled to Britain in Trench's version of reality, and the Temple of the Stars provided the information, the cosmology, from which the Great Pyramid would then be built millennia later. So Men Among Mankind is probably the first clear expression of the 60s Glastonbury cosmic millennialism that would ultimately lead to the transformation of the town into the spontaneous, mystical social experiment that it now represents. And that book would be republished as Temple of the Stars in 1973. Now, during the same formative period of time, at the start of the 60s, other ideas that were to link British sites with UFOs were being formulated. There'd been a sustained season of sightings in France in 1954, and it came to be believed that the lights in the sky were travelling in straight lines. And this led British enthusiast Tony Wedd, who'd seen a UFO as far back as 1941, to wonder if they used ley lines to navigate by. Now, Tony Wedd, had been born in Somerset in 1919, and he became aware of the Zodiac concept when he was quite young, before the Second World War, walking around the area of Langport, where the guardian dog figure supposedly resides. And when he was in the RAF, he was posted to Canada. He actually met Catherine Malt Wood in 1943, and only a little bit of information about their conversation remains, which is a real shame. But he comes to be interested in UFOs and the whole range of things. The free energy of Nikola Tesla, the all-going work of Wilhelm Reich, telepathic contact with the Space Brothers. And in May 1960, he was working with an experienced mystic contactee called Mary Long. And he was becoming interested in clumps of trees. This was something that lay pioneer Alfred Watkins had suggested was sometimes indicative of alignments. Mary Long had some altered state of consciousness in Wedd's home, saw the walls dissolve, saw a nearby clump of trees on a hill. They started plotting things out on a map and satisfied themselves that UFOs were sighted in relation to these alignments. And he produced a booklet called Skyways and Landmarks. And this was incredibly influential. This was 1961. It actually led to the creation of the famous Lay Hunter magazine. And Brinsley le Poer Trench, in a letter to the second edition of the Lay Hunter, said that lays are a most important part of the Flying Saucer saga. Now, A quick shout out to this wonderful book. I learned an awful lot about British ufology with this book. It's a lot of fun, although these guys don't approach the subject in quite the same way I do. It's highly recommended. I would also say a shout out to Warminster, because it's in 1965 that British ufology is focused on Warminster. At the end of August this year, there's a 50-year retrospective conference, because on that bank holiday weekend, thousands of visitors poured into the town. So it's a measure of the interest in that subject at that time. And here's a wonderfully young-looking John Michell by Glastonbury Tour. His first book, The Flying Saucer Vision, was, as he later acknowledged, a genuine artefact of 1967, and therefore it has all its virtues and vices. It's the year of LSD and the summer of love. And it exemplifies a way of thought that had been developing since the full advent of the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, a decade or so earlier. His important insight, his important attitude in this work is that it's very difficult to establish the definitive cause. So he advocates the usefulness of observing the effects. You know, many people who were drawn into this mystery found themselves looking into other subjects on the edge of consensus reality, finding apparent connections. There's a chapter entitled The Dragon, the Holy Grail and the Flying Saucer, and he wonders whether the accounts of blinding light and spectral visitations in the Arthurian romances refer to a class of events that includes Virgin Mary manifestations such as Fatima. Is a flying saucer cult the basis of all religion? Light phenomena have been associated with sites of ancient sanctity, and it seemed that this would have been a known factor in their placing and whatever actually occurred there. And although John Michell doesn't really go into what we might call the Trench space opera, he does ponder in his Grail chapter the possibility that if the Glastonbury Zodiac could only be appreciated from the air, did that mean it was deliberately constructed, not just to make a microcosmic mirror of the heavens on Earth, but to perhaps play a part in interaction with extraterrestrials? The fourth edition of the alternative culture hippie publication Gandalf's Garden was published in the spring of 1969. The editorial wondered, is 69 to be the year of Atlantis? And the first article is entitled Atlantis Rising. And it began, Atlantis is no longer either a fact or a fiction. It has become something greater than both, a hope in man's breast. And in this edition, you see the first form of the work of the woman who took up Catherine Malt Wood's whole idea of the Glastonbury Zodiac, Mary Kane, and probably got it to more people than anyone else. If you get hold of a copy of Gandalf's Garden issue 4, and you can find it online actually, you can download it, you'll see a dense article on the Glastonbury Giants in which the whole of Mary Kane's future work, can be seen quite clearly placed there. So all of this, begins to set a certain mood for 1969 and for Glastonbury. It's also the year in which indubitably the greatest of all Earth Mysteries classics, John Michell's The View Over Atlantis, is published, achieving instant cult classic status. And he doesn't really talk that much about UFOs in here, but because he's already covered it in his first book. But the work of Catherine Malt Wood is again featured. And ideas about dragons and flying saucers now give way to the revelation of the existence of the Michell ley line. It's in August 1969 that a UFO enthusiast, David Bowie, arranged with some friends a free festival at Beckenham in London, and later wrote a song about it in commemoration. And to me, Memory of a Free Festival by David Bowie evokes the 60s every much as Sgt. Pepper. There's something tremendously evocative about psychedelic ufology. We scanned the skies with rainbow eyes and saw machines of every shape and size. We talked with tall Venusians passing through. That summer of '69 is absolutely mythological, in as much as within 1 month you've got the moon landing, the Manson murders, and Woodstock. You know, we're going to see the moon landing somewhat deconstructed tomorrow, but there's no doubt about the fact that it was an epic thing in the collective conscious of the time. And it's against this background that Anthony Roberts has his great experience. And we're going to introduce him a little bit. He'd been born in 1940, and he came to Avalon, to Glastonbury, to the Mythos, from a background of anarchistic activism. You know, as an advocate of the CND cause, he broke into an American airbase as far back as 1963 in an attempt to disable some of the planes. He and his wife Janet met through campaigning against the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. That's 1964. And he was repeatedly arrested at political protests and attained maximum street credibility by starting a fire in the foyer of the Dorchester Hotel as a statement against capitalism. Now, can you imagine how he would be treated if that happened today? You know, it's amazing that he didn't get put away in prison. As a young man, he corresponded with Tolkien. He worked as a librarian at the London Evening News and then the Times, and this just allowed him to just read huge amounts of whatever on earth he wanted to and develop this mystical conviction of the eternal true nature of the spiritual tradition of Britain, as best exemplified by William Blake. He'd read John Michell's Flying Saucer Vision in 1967. This had opened him up to the ufological Earth Mysteries connection, and most importantly of all, the Glastonbury Zodiac. And he and his wife Jan spent a fair amount of time around Glastonbury during the time of the early hippie pilgrims and more sober mystics in the late 60s. Now, this is him in a car in 1968. Probably by the next year, his hair's got a bit longer. But remembering John Michell's advice concerning the difficulties in establishing the definitive cause of the UFO phenomenon and the usefulness of observing its effects will be a valuable perspective to maintain. So here's his own account of what happened. While driving with my wife one evening during the autumn of 1969, we were shown both a vision and a sign in the sky. We were driving south out of London towards Dorking and had reached the Tolworth roundabout on the Kingston bypass. It was not quite dark. The air was very clear and there was as yet no trace of the moon. At the same time, both my wife and I saw a huge white disc shining in the sky in the middle distance ahead of us. It was about the size of a very large grapefruit, and as we slowed down to watch, its colour changed slightly to silvery gold with faint tinges of orange fire playing around the extreme edges. We slowed our car still more, and as we watched, we saw a string of small glowing discs appear on the left-hand side of the larger one. They flickered and twinkled with a pearly and opalescent glow, faintly mauve and very beautiful. After lining up in a perfectly straight formation, they gradually merged one by one into the larger disc. Whatever it was, suddenly, with tremendous speed and in complete silence, the huge object moved from in front of our car to behind it in a matter of seconds. We quickly stopped and got out. It now hung motionless in the distance, and as we looked up at it, a terrific feeling of peace, physical lightness, and spiritual happiness came over us, leaving us deeply moved. The strange aerial object next began moving very swiftly towards us, pulsating faintly, with a green light blazing on one side and a blue light on the other. It stopped again and hovered low in the sky to the northeast, then began to move slowly, quartering the air in precise, sweepingly geometrical lines, rather like a fish darting through water. It was tracing a definite star pattern in the sky, which had now become dark, and as we stared in wonder, it yet again stopped and hung like an exquisite glowing jewel above us. Then suddenly it was gone, With unbelievable acceleration, it shot upwards into space and vanished into the now starry night. The whole sighting had lasted 20 minutes, and yet it felt as though we'd been watching for hours. And in the memorial booklet to Tony Roberts, published in 1990, his wife Jan recalled how we sat and cried. For me, it felt as though I'd glimpsed God in action. Although this was mechanical activity, I was moved as though I had a religious experience. Now, something of the mixed blessings of such close encounters manifested only a few days later when Tony was knocked off his scooter by a car, and the injuries he sustained required 6 months off work. But this enabled him to fully experience what you might call a massive download, in which he undertook a marathon reading and writing stint, fired up by the revelatory experience. Now, here he is in 1971. It's good that we've got a lava lamp over here. I think this would fit very nicely into the room that you see pictured there. A manuscript of 300 big pages, a work of historical synthesis and speculative imagination, provisionally entitled Giants in the Earth, resulted during the following year. It was a wild mix, firmly based on the existence of Mu and Atlantis. The lost continents were featured in considerable detail. And Tony Roberts was a passionate devotee of fantasy literature, and he used something of its novelistic format to convey the density of detail that he'd amassed from a variety of sources. Radiant 15-foot-tall aliens walked the earth amongst us, and after Mu was destroyed following a comet strike, they helped in the establishment of Atlantis. Now, all this stuff was typed up, and it was put into a kind of hardback folder with various pictures and maps. You can see him holding a copy there. And as I say, I was the first person in 40 years to actually read all of this. So he starts off with the Lost Continents, and then the second part of Giants is called The Colonies of Atlantis, and it deals with Egypt, Britain and the Americas. And the ideas of Brinsley le Poer Trench are quite clearly strongly pleasant. There are long, long quotes from him. And most importantly, the belief that the Glastonbury Zodiac is the work of Atlanteans. You know, they initially arrived in Britain 20,000 years ago, when the settlements that had all been founded here in the time of Mu had already long disappeared. And their presence was strongest in Ireland and Cornwall and Somerset. And where British folklore is full of references to dragons and giants and fairies and inundations and powerful races of magical beings from the sea, all of this is a reference to Atlantis. As he would later say in his book So Is a Thunder, which was extracted from this mother lode, behind every megalithic stone there looms the shadow of a giant. Behind every giant there shines the imagery of a transcendent culture of divinely inspired beings. And building on Leslie and Trench, he brings in the Vimanas, talks about the Great Pyramid having been built by the magical powers of the Atlantean adepts and the giants in 15,000 BC, using levitation, telekinesis and vibrational manipulation of sound. Now, his first ever book, Atlantean Traditions in Ancient Britain, has an extensive treatment of the Glastonbury Zodiac, and it's taken pretty much verbatim out of this Giants in the Earth mother lode, and likewise, So Is a Thunder. Now, I'm often wonder, since I read this, what it would have been like if it had been published back in, say, 1971, 72, and took its place alongside all these kind of books that we probably are all familiar with, books that, the mere tactile impression of their paperback covers, the smell of these books even almost evokes what is in them. That basically, it is part of that same period of time, whether it's submerged under the surface and we're only just starting to find out about it, it's still there. Now, during the period of writing, the Roberts had another strange experience with mysterious lights, this time on Glastonbury tour. There was a guy in town who owned a cafe on the back of Benedict Street that had got quite a famous mural of the Michael line and the Glastonbury Zodiac painted on it. A guy called Gino Gennaro, who was responsible in 1979 for one of the weirdest of all Glastonbury works, and that is saying something, believe me. The phenomenon of Avalon, the story of this planet as recounted by the fairies. You know, he encountered Venusians stroke fairies on Glastonbury tour and received some kind of Gnostic hermetic teaching from them that he writes down in this book and illustrates with Blake's artwork. Gino Gennaro and his wife had a kind of picnic on the slopes of the tour with Tony and Jan Roberts, and it was just like the combination of these people was too much. Spheres of light just started appearing from the earth and floating around them. Now this is a bit of artwork by Osmond Kane, who's the husband of Mary Kane, and it's quite a good representation of the Arthur figure, delineated by all the fields and roads and so on in the Glastonbury Zodiac. 1971 was the first big Glastonbury Music Festival. There'd been a little one in 1970, but the main one, the one that really kicked it off with the Pyramid Stage and all the rest of it, that was filmed as Glastonbury Fair, happened in June 1971. And it was one of the big on-buttons for what the town has become. You know, it was a very mystical event, and it stimulated an awful lot of people to become interested in this place and come here. And while it was happening, Tony and Jan Roberts were up on the tour, and they were looking in the direction of where the festival was, trying to see the tents and so on. And Jan actually sees briefly, when she's looking in the direction of the site, which is in the broad direction of this Arthur figure, an enormous titanic form rise up out of the landscape, made from the very earth itself. You know, the titanic form of the Glastonbury Zodiac, Sagittarius Arthur figure. A real giant in the earth, rising as the modern Glastonbury was coming into being, and nicely completing the period of the enormous burst of creativity begun in 1969. So we fast forward to 1977, because, you know, I'm putting these things together. The anthology, Glastonbury, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, and what lay in the background of the person responsible for this anthology, Tony Roberts. 1977, pretty weird year in Britain. You know, we remember it for punk rock, but there's a lot of echoes of 67 flowing through as well. Some interesting books coming out. Stephen Jenkins, Undiscovered Country, classic of lay hunting, ufology, the whole paranormal spectrum. The wild suggestion, because he was an initiate of Mongolian Kala Chakra teachings, that Glastonbury might actually be Shambhala. Geoffrey Ash's Ancient Wisdom, a cultural connection suggested between Glastonbury and Central Asia. And Cosmic Trigger, the whole incredible smorgasbord of 60s lore, psychedelia, ufology, the Kennedy assassination, magic, Leary, Crowley, the whole thing, all comes out. We've got the all-time classic, you know, UFO movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We've got one of the greatest cult TV kids programs ever. My first introduction to the Avebury Stone Circle, Children of the Stones. And Steve Hillage, Motivation Radio. In 77, the light shone from our hearts and from our eyes. We looked into the ethers and we saw that they were very much alive. The sources were teaching us to find a higher energy, to put a twinkle in our mind's eyes so we can rise and be all that we can be. Here's the original and the 1977 version of the anthology. The original came out in 1976, but the 77 version, which had an afterword by Colin Wilson, is the one that everyone remembers. And in many respects, it's the high watermark of acceptance of the whole idea of the Glastonbury Zodiac. After that, you know, things start to significantly change. But you would find, you know, many gatherings, Tony and Jan representing Glastonbury, selling their stuff, selling Mary Kane stuff. Tony Roberts said in the anthology that Glastonbury was a planetary beacon and powerhouse of the spirit, prophesying that the revolutionary revival of Albion's true spirit will be the precursor of a new age, and that apocalyptic revival will spring from the eternally universal fountainhead that is Glastonbury, and the day draws nearer. Now, towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s, paranoia creeps in. A lot of people involved in ufology started to believe that, in fact, UFOs were angels of the Antichrist, that demonic forces were involved. Tony Roberts got kind of pulled into this. I'm not going to go into it in any real detail at all, other than to say that the vibe shifted round about circa 1980. And the Earth mysteries, ley lines, terrestrial zodiacs got absolutely bashed to pieces by many people. And this particular book that came out in 1983, Ley Lines in Question, is a good example of that. Now, these days, you know, Ancient Aliens has revitalised a corpus of work that seems to have come from a 60s and 70s time warp. You know, Eric von Daniken has confidently returned to state what he initially propounded 40 years ago, with no concessions to any criticisms in between. And once again, the Great Pyramid, the Nazca Lines, the Easter Island figures are paraded as mysteries with an extraterrestrial explanation. But there's no sign of the Glastonbury Zodiac there, and there's a good reason for that, because the other sites that are mentioned, the pyramid and so on, are unquestionably real. They are genuine artefacts of archaeology, regardless of interpretation. And the same cannot be said for the Somerset Star Temple. You know, there is no real historical information, no archaeology. And yet, on the other hand, you know, I have to say that I had one of the great transformational experiences of the whole of my life with the Glastonbury Zodiac. Here's some drawings by Yuri Leach representing Andrew Collins, great friend of the conference, in a possible past life as a Knight of Danbury that led him on to an incredible psychic quest around the Glastonbury Zodiac, and that ultimately led him to the Giza Plateau and his discovery of a cave system there that he wrote about in Beneath the Pyramids. And this is a painting by the great psychic Bernard G that he worked with at that time that gives you a tiny bit of a doorway into what was going on there. You see, this is the thing, the Glastonbury Zodiac is so intangible, and yet Andy Collins would say quite clearly he was led to the Giza Plateau by his experiences in the Glastonbury Zodiac. He's quite happy to say that. There's a big account of that in my 500-page monster Avalonian Eon of my tremendously transformational experience. Now, it wouldn't seem outlandish to recommend to a lover of poetry a reading course in the early 19th century romantics like Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley and Byron, and of course William Blake. Now, these people had some knowledge of British prehistory, of religious studies, that would seem now lacking or wrong-headed. Their sensibilities were obviously shaped by the times, the French Revolution, blah, blah. We don't have to believe in the reality of a Druid Stonehenge to appreciate Blake's art and poetry. Dion Fortune said in Avalon of the Heart that the poetry of the soul writes itself at Glastonbury. I feel that there's a kind of soul poetry in John Foster Forbes, in Desmond Leslie, in Brinsley le Poer Trench, certainly John Michell, and in the worldview demonstrated in Anthony Roberts' Giants in the Earth. I believe there is also something vitally important in the kind of mysterious experience that befell the Roberts near the Kingston bypass, and in the weird trickster life of a figure like Adamski. Some mercurial force was at work through all this, loosening the mind-forged manacles, opening the doors of perception, enough to awaken us from single vision. We can comprehensively deconstruct the mythology of Glastonbury in terms of its history, for sure. Don't think I don't know that. But it's that elusive something else that matters. You know, what was inspiring in 1977, the sources of the original anthology, Glastonbury, Ancient Avalon, New Jerusalem, was all manner of subterranean ufological earth mysteries ideas in the 60s and through into the 70s. They fed into that time. And beyond the changing modes of passing decades, we can still find inspiration here and now. And it was actually 1 month ago 1 month ago today, on the 24th of June, I met with Jan Roberts at a cafe in Glastonbury, and I decided that being as it looked as if the anthology new edition simply wasn't going to surface in time for this event, that I wondered, could I actually expand this introduction, bring in some other material, and actually create a whole little book ready in time for this event a month later? And I did, and here it is, and I am, as I say, effectively launching it right here, right now with this event, and it is a measure of the voltage that is present in this event. All kinds of things are happening, as you'll realise if you've already attended, and as you realise in the months to come, there are some significant inspirations occurring here. So I commend all of these ideas. I commend my book to you. It is available out there on the author's stall, and I will be hanging about, and I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. But for now, yay.
Paul Weston, thank you very much indeed.